This is a presentation of the University of Wisconsin Parkside.
Thank you, Linda, for that really warm introduction. Let's see, I'm getting my watch here so I can keep track of what time it is. It's a great pleasure to be here, and particularly considering that I had spent almost 10 years teaching here, to be back on familiar turf, visiting with people I know has been just an absolute treat. As some of you know, over the years that I've been working in teacher education, I've spent a lot of time trying to help teachers understand the nature of institutional discrimination and especially institutional racism. Because if we can't get our hands around how institutional discrimination works and how it's been constructed, then we can't really work very effectively to dismantle it. And I have run into, over the years, a lot of reactions and difficulties that students and teachers, and particularly those of us who are white, have understanding these concepts. I frequently hear things like, well, I didn't have anything to do with establishing racism, or I didn't own slaves, so I feel like I'm being blamed now for something happened a long time ago. Or I'll hear things like, well, I don't have a culture, and sort of they have a culture, but I don't have a culture, and something isn't right about all of that. And an example is, now let's see if I can work this thing right. This was a quote that a teacher who I'd been working with a few years ago said that kind of illustrates this idea that, thinking back to her own family history, she thought about how her parents had worked themselves up, pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. And she was saying this in a context of where she was working primarily with African American students. And her meaning was attempting to silence what African Americans have been saying about dealing with and trying to confront and challenge racism. Because she was sort of like, well, they're asking for something extra that we didn't have. And these kinds of reactions, both to whether institutional racism exists now, how it affects me, whether it exists historically, have led me to want to take a closer look at my own roots. When I'm teaching, I can talk about how I'm a beneficiary of white privilege now, and how people will look at me and make certain assumptions about me just on the basis of what I look like, and then treat me accordingly. But when I try to think about the legacies of white privilege that I stand on, that's become a little fuzzier, because I realized that I didn't have a very good understanding of my own family's background. So I decided that I wanted to trace my own family history. And in the process of doing that, and just as an aside, for those of you, as you start to get gray hair, a lot of people who are getting gray hair become interested then in tracing their family history. I'm not sure what it is about that, but it seems to be sort of a common thing. But in the course of doing that, I've been developing something of what I'm calling critical family studies, or critical family history research. This website I'm putting everything I talk about here on a website that I'm creating, and occasionally as I do updates to it, I send a link to family members so that they can take a look and see what I'm up to, and either give me feedback or whatever kind of reactions. And sometimes they've sent me stuff. And the URL is at the top if anybody decides that they want to go there, or if you don't write it down and later you want to go there, you can actually find it by going to www.christinesleader.org. It only costs $10 to buy your domain name, which is great. christinesleader.org, and then you'll see a link that will take you here. But critical family history, I think of it as a process of locating your family history in a socio-cultural historical context, and I'll explain more exactly of what that means in a few minutes. It's informed by critical theoretical traditions, which I won't spend too much time on here. But I'm working with critical race theory and critical whiteness studies, which looks at the permanency of race and racism in the structure of the United States and tries to understand how race operates. Critical theory, which comes mostly out of looking at how the social class structure keeps getting reproduced, particularly in the context of a capitalist economic structure. And critical feminist theories, which look at the reproduction of patriarchal structures, and even though sexism relationships may change over time, there's still some real deep-seated, deep-rooted institutions of sexism in this country. Critical family history research involves two different kinds of research. One of them being genealogy research that quite a few people are doing now, and then the other being the sociocultural context research. And I'll just say a wee bit about how I do each of those, because that gives you a little bit of an idea as to when I start telling some stories where they came from. For genealogy research, there are several tools that are actually fairly accessible now on the internet, where you can get a lot of vital statistics information. There are other places to get vital statistics, but through something like Ancestry.com, which you can do it for free for a couple weeks and then they start charging you after you're hooked. But you have access there to original documents such as census records, records of buying land. So there's information about wills and a whole bunch of stuff that's in there, and they keep adding stuff all the time. Or there are local family history centers, places where you can go and get a lot of this information for free. Family stories and documents. I actually didn't think we had anything until I started asking around among family members, and then discovered things like, boxes off in somebody's garage that when they'd cleaned out their parents' home, and there were things in there. Immigration records, particularly through Ellis Island, there'd be information. Land and probate records, I'll be making reference to some that I found going to county courthouses, because that can become very revealing in looking at who bought and sold property and how property was handed down. Newspapers, obituaries, biographies, and slave narratives, etc., other kinds of published resources. A lot of towns, and it seems to be especially towns in the Midwest, had a lot of newspapers that have since been digitized. And there's a whole bunch of historical information that you can find looking at these digitized resources. And then DNA testing, which I won't mention in this talk, but I did have done to try to answer some questions, actually raise some other kind of questions. For the sociocultural context work, I put the family data next to, I'll show you a chart in a minute, but next to a set of questions that asks me what else was going on in the same time in the same place where a particular family member was. It could be the same village or the same county or the same region of the country. What was happening? Who else was around? What other sociocultural groups were around? What were relationships among groups? Or if others weren't around that could have been around, why weren't they? What kinds of laws were in place? And I used two different kinds of histories. One is histories that were written at the time. For instance, if I'm talking about something that occurred, say, in the 1860s, to try to find the historical information that was written close around that time by people who actually witnessed events. And there's quite a bit that you can find now that Google has been digitizing books on Google Books. And then histories that were written retrospectively by historians now, looking back at things that have happened, say, 100 years ago, that give also additional information and additional insights, and that can be used to contextualize the stories. So as I've worked through my own research, I've developed charts that look sort of like this, of where I'm going, let's see if this works, decade by decade, where you see on the column over there, the decades, and then next to that, the information that I was able to find genealogically about specific family members, and then the historical and sociocultural context that then I kind of interactively interpret what was happening. So that's how I got to the stories that I'll be sharing with you here. The family history, family tree that I have right now on the web looks something like this. It's sort of not particularly aesthetic, but it starts over there from my generation to the parents, the grandparents, the great-grandparents, the great-greats, and the great-great-greats. If I can find information about the great-great-greats or farther back than that. And I'm starting historically back, moving forward. So the work I've done so far is in the 1800s, and so that's mostly what I'll be talking about this morning. As I've been doing this work, I've been identifying themes that recur through several of the family stories, and I'm going to talk about 3 of them today. The first one is the theme, many European immigrants built wealth on a playing field the U.S. government established for whites only. And I want to look at how that's benefited me and people who look like me in today's society. And I want to start by looking at some statistics from today, or at least this is 2002, which is as close as today that I could get from the Census Bureau. And the chart here shows the average net worth of homes broken out by race. And you'll see some pretty stark inequities there, but particularly if you look at household net worth. Just take a look there for a minute. I know probably nobody in the room is feeling like wealthy, but still the distribution of wealth in this country is enormously skewed on the basis of race. And the popular mythology that most of us have is that families have what they have and got what they got by their hard work. And so looking at this, you think, oh gosh, it looks like white people work harder than anybody else, which ignores the fact that the bulk of wealth in this country has actually been passed down through inheritance. And most of us don't really talk about that. This book here on inheritance estimates that about 80% of what families have now came through inheritance rather than through the individual work of the family. So it's that inheritance piece that I want to take a look at as it relates to my family story and applies to me. And I'm just going to briefly situate this within critical race theory, and particularly the work of Cheryl Harris, who is writing in the Harvard Law Review about whiteness as property and how white skin gradually, historically, took on the same characteristics of property in the law, which she traces to the institutionalization of slavery as well as the appropriation of indigenous lands, both of which become relevant in unpacking my own family story. As it relates to slavery, she talks about how race and property converged beginning back in the 1600s when the earliest slave codes were established in the state of Virginia. But across the United States in 1790, when the Census Bureau established its classification system for classifying everybody on the basis of race, they had 3 categories. And this persisted, these 3 categories, for about the next 50 years. White, slave, and other free. And everybody had to get classified regardless of whether they chose to or not. And since white carried the most privileges, people would try to get classified as white, because then you had the privileges of being able to buy property, get education. If you were male and had property, you could vote. But there were definite legal privileges that went along with the classification as white. And this persisted. As it relates to indigenous land, the way the U.S. government established land ownership had to do mainly with whether European types of structures were put on the land. As the U.S. government wanted to take land from indigenous people and couldn't do so by use of paperwork, which it was later doing to take land from Mexicans, the thinking that went into it is if you're not using the land as Europeans have used the land, then it's up for grabs, and Europeans can move in and establish European structures and then claim ownership of the land. So with those two as a kind of a theoretical backdrop, let me start looking now at my family history. I'm going to look at the wealth on my father's side of the family as it moved through 2 generations. And then I'll take a look, a brief look on my mother's side of the family. This is my father's side of the family. They were German Americans. This is obviously not the only story to tell about my father's side of the family, but it's still a significant story. And I'm going to trace property through, oh, come on here. Okay, through 2 generations. William Henry Sleater, who immigrated to the U.S., and then his son, William Philip Sleater. And you can see there's my parents at the bottom there. So this story takes place in Illinois, just to the south of here. So here we have Illinois with 2 stars on it. One of the stars near Decatur is representing Blue Mound, which is a very small town just south of Decatur, where the Sleaters first immigrated to. And then another star at Beardstown in Cass County, Illinois, which is where another strand of the family, the Yakishes, immigrated to at roughly the same time. But since the white people weren't the first people there, then I'm going to disappear them a little bit and look at the land before white people got there as to who was there. This is who was in Illinois before the whites started moving in. The red square settlements are the Kickapoo. And other designations on here are Fox, Sauk, Menominee, Potawatomi, towns that were in various places in Illinois. But the Kickapoo at the time that Europeans came were the largest group. So let me move the map kind of over to the side now and then kind of start doing a little bit of history telling here. The Kickapoo were not actually originally from Illinois. The Kickapoo had earlier been more over to the east around Ohio and the area of Michigan. But as whites were moving westward, a lot of the indigenous nations were pressed westward. So the Kickapoo moved up into Michigan, then over into Wisconsin, and then by the early 1700s had gone down from Wisconsin into Illinois and had set up the various towns that you see here. In the early 1800s, whites started moving into central Illinois, first in the form of trappers and traders. And in 1816, then the first trading post was set up in Decatur, Illinois. I mean, in the Chicago area, there was more going on before that, but I'm just looking at the places where my ancestors came. But shortly after that, Illinois became a state. And at the time, the United States then would admit a piece of territory into the Union, some processes started following pretty rapidly. The indigenous people who were here, a first priority of the United States government was to move them out and repopulate the area with whites, either from other parts of the U.S. or more commonly importing people from Europe. And so the U.S. military would be kind of the force pushing against indigenous people, and the surveyors would come along and then survey the land into 40-acre parcels that would then be sold at a very low rate to the whites who were imported in. So 1818, Illinois became a state. 1819, the Kickapoo signed one of 20 cession treaties giving up additional land as the military was pushing against them and trying to push them out. And they were sort of trying to stay as best they could. In 1821, one set of my relatives, and I won't be talking about this set in this talk because I don't have enough time, but the Yakishes then came up the Mississippi River into Cass County and bought land and then established farms there. By 1822, there were only about 400 Kickapoo that were left in Illinois. Most had been moved forcibly out of Illinois to southern states, Missouri, Texas. Some went on to Mexico, just sort of get out of this country. In 1824, white residents started to arrive in Macon County, which is where Decatur is. In 1832, up in the more northwestern corner of Illinois, along the border with Iowa, Chief Black Hawk pushed back forcibly against white incursion. And the different indigenous nations were reacting differently to the pressure that they were getting from white settlers as well as the U.S. government. Some, such as the Iowa, were sort of trying to take up farming so that they would be regarded as this is our land according to the standards that the white folks have. And others, and Chief Black Hawk was really one of them, said this is our land and you're not going to control it and you're not going to control us. And so Chief Black Hawk, as the whites were moving in, pushed back forcibly, and between Black Hawk and the military, then you had a series of wars which ultimately the Sauk and the Fox lost, and then the rest of the indigenous people were pushed out. So it was into this context that my ancestor Wilhelm Heinrich Schlichter, William Henry Sleater, arrived in Macon County, Illinois. And it needs to be clear that he was coming into, and the Yakishes as well, into a context that had been established for whites only. The states were working with transportation companies to bring in whites from Europe. I read about this less in a U.S. publication than in a publication in Canada, where the writer was wondering why the Germans weren't going to Canada, and wrote about the processes that some of the states were using, contracting with local transportation companies to set up. It would almost sort of be like a modern-day equivalent of tours. Of somebody would go over to a European country, recruit people from a village, and then bring them as a whole, arrange for their transportation, and they would have in mind a place where the village was going to be settled. So it wasn't just the case of, the Schlichters woke up one morning and said, oh, I think I'll go to America. How do you do that? But there was a system that was worked up to try to get people to come over here. And you can see in the census statistics how Macon County then was becoming rapidly a white area. Then in 1853, the Illinois state legislature passed a law prohibiting African Americans from actually spending the night in Illinois, moving to Illinois. So you couldn't, if you were African American and free and had money, you couldn't buy land, because if you can't live in a state, it's real hard to go and buy land there. So the land was specifically set aside for whites only. So the money that was made from that land was very explicitly set up for whites to be able to do that. So let me look here at land acquisition in the Sleater family. Wilhelm Schlichter arrived in 1846. 3 years later, he bought 40 acres from the U.S. government. And in Ancestry.com, you can find records of the land purchases. So here are records of the 40 acres he bought in 1849, as well as an additional 160 acres he bought in 1853. And I'm going to trace that 160 acres because I was able to find information on what happened with it. So I have it in blue there. It didn't say in the census record how much he paid for the land, but I was able to find an article talking about land values in agrarian Illinois from the early 1800s up through the present. So using those figures, I was able to estimate how much he paid. And according to the estimate, he would have paid about $8 an acre. And so by the time he bought those two holdings, if you translated that all into $2007, so we have something that we can work with that's, you know, comprehensible now, he would have about $39,000 worth of land, which is sort of interesting to think about because he paid cash for the land. And so the image of him coming over with nothing but the shirt on his back kind of doesn't exactly hold up when you look at his ability to buy land. I know that a lot of immigrants did come to the U.S. with nothing but the shirt on their back, but in the case of the Sleeter ancestry, that doesn't seem to have been the case. Wilhelm Schlichter died in 1866, presumably of a heart attack because they run on my father's side of the family. He had several kids. One of them, about a second or third son, was my great-grandfather, William Philip Sleeter, who didn't inherit the 160 acres. The older brother did. But in 1894, William Philip Sleeter got the 160 acres. I'm not exactly sure how he got it from his brother, legally I'm sure. But this was all written up in a newspaper article in Decatur. I mentioned Decatur had a lot of newspapers, and they would tell like all kinds of stuff, you know, who went to whose birthday parties in addition to land selling and buying. So in this newspaper article, it specified that this 160 acres that William P. Sleeter acquired was the same 160 acres that his father had bought from the U.S. government. He then 2 years later sold that 160 acres, and this again was in the newspaper, for $90 an acre, which would bring it to about $250,000 by then. So in that, you know, period of about 50 years, you can see the appreciation of land value. He then bought 360 acres in Iowa up in Storm Lake for what was the equivalent of almost $500,000. The story doesn't get real great after that because 2 years later he died of appendicitis, and it turns out that the land itself was swampy and wasn't worth the money that he had paid for it. But still, the family was able to sell the land, and it helped, as far as I can tell, finance my grandfather Ralston Sleeter then not having to continue to work on the farm and being able to go full-time to Iowa State University to get his bachelor's degree and then his MD degree, which he got in a fairly short amount of time. So I'm inferring that he was able to take money from the sale of his father's land to finance his education so that he could become a physician. Then my father then took after him and became a physician. Ralston moved to Medford, Oregon, where I was born, where my father was born, and what I inherited from all of this was growing up in a professional class family, which has certainly given me advantages in terms of just, you know, the schools that I've been able to attend and all of that kind of thing. But I can trace now some of the class privilege that I was born into to the racial construction of property and property ownership historically. Does that sort of make sense? Quick question? Yeah, on the census, he lists himself as being a farmer. He was also on the county board of supervisors, so I think he was doing things other than, you know, out plowing every day. But on the census, he does list himself as being a farmer. I'll tell just a brief snippet of a similar story from East Tennessee on my mother's side of the family. This is my grandmother, Iva Harris McCaslin Fawcett at the bottom here. And so I'll be looking just a little bit at the McCaslins and the Harrises in East Tennessee. I've got way more information, but just not enough time here to share it. This is the Cherokee Nation, because that's whose land now we're going to be talking about. And you can see where Tennessee is in relationship to the Cherokee Nation. And I'll be talking specifically about families' land in Sweetwater and Madisonville in Monroe County, Tennessee, and the arrow points to where it is, which you can see is absolutely right in the middle of what used to be the Cherokee Nation. And taking land from the Cherokee is another one of those like really, really terrible stories in U.S. history. The Cherokee could see what was happening, and the Cherokee, maybe more than any of the other Indian nations, tried very hard to be seen as equally civilized according to the standards that the Europeans were using. And so this is a picture of Chief Sequoyah, who had invented the alphabet. The Cherokee established schools, had very high rates of literacy, established a lot of businesses. Some of the businesses were run collaboratively with some of the whites. There was a road that was built through Monroe County that was built through a kind of cross-national business group. And the blacksmith shops, cotton machines, and all that kind of stuff. In 1829, gold was discovered on Cherokee land in Georgia. And that's when the U.S. government decided, the Cherokee land had been chipped away at up until that point. And the Cherokee holdings by 1829 were much smaller than the big map that I showed. But in 1829, when gold was discovered in Georgia, the U.S. government said, okay, that's it, we want the land, we've got to get the Cherokees out of here. So Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. The U.S. Supreme Court sided with the Cherokee and said that that's illegal, you can't do that. But President Andrew Jackson, who wanted the Cherokee out, and sort of doesn't matter what the Supreme Court says, sent the U.S. military in anyway, and so the Cherokee were then forcibly deported on what came to be known as the Trail of Tears. Thus, again, sort of clearing the way to move whites in and make Tennessee much more of a white area. Okay. So we have the same system then of what happens with the land. The U.S. government transferred the land to the states. The states surveys the land and sells the land cheaply to whites. So looking at Monroe County, Tennessee, the first piece of land was sold by the state to a white person in 1817. Now, I knew that my Harris ancestors had moved to Monroe County from Washington County farther north, somewhere in the 1820s, but I didn't really know. I just didn't really know very much. So about a year ago, I was invited to do a workshop at a college in North Georgia and use the visit there to drive up into Tennessee and to spend some time kind of plowing around in records. And I went to the Tennessee County Courthouse, which this is a picture of it now, and spent a good part of the day plowing through archives looking at deeds records, and found all kinds of stuff. I'm going to have to go back because there was like way more than I almost didn't even know what I was looking at because there was this gold mine there. But a little bit of what I found is very helpful. I think this is about four great grandfather George Harris in 1827 purchased 160 acres in Monroe County for what would have been the equivalent today of about $2,000. This was land that was purchased directly from the state of Tennessee. So it had been, before that, it had been Cherokee land. So he was kind of like the first white owner of this land, so it was sold to him fairly cheaply. On the McCaslin side of the family, a year later, William McCaslin purchased 67 acres for about $4,600 in U.S. In $2007. Probably better farmland, which is why he paid more per acre for it. I don't really know. But by 1860, I know how much their holdings were worth because that's in the census. By 1860, the George Harris family wealth, when you pull together what was reported on the census as being real estate and property, was like $250,000. And the McCaslin family wealth was about $200,000, a little under $250,000. George Harris was a big wheeler dealer in terms of buying and selling property. I could definitely see that in the deeds records. And so as property would escalate in value, he would sell one piece and buy another piece in order to accumulate this level of wealth. I know that I've seen his will that the money was equally distributed among his heirs, and he had a whole bunch of them. So to my great-grandfather would have gone somewhere around $40,000, which would be enough to get started with a farm. It wasn't like this huge amount, but it was still enough to kind of establish himself as a farmer, buy some land, and get the family going. I also know, partly through the census records and partly also by looking at the deeds in the county courthouse, that George Harris was also a slave owner. And I've looked some into the history and experiences of African Americans in East Tennessee, and East Tennessee actually wasn't a large slaveholding area. It's too hilly to have big plantations. So most of the people who lived there were not slave owners. And the slave owners who were there, most of them only owned like less than a dozen slaves, which was the case in my family. In fact, I found out from reading this book that the experience in my family was probably typical of the average slaveholder in the South, both in terms of demographics as well as in terms of owning a relatively small number of slaves. That it was only about 10% of slaveholders that had the large plantations. But what this means for me is that some of the wealth that eventually got passed down to me was built not only on taking land from the Cherokee, but also on the backs of people who were not getting paid for the work that they were doing. So to go back here to the popular mythology that we get what we work for, and I today am not to blame for anything that happened in the past. I may not be to blame for what happened in the past, but we still need to be held accountable for what happened in the past, because much of what we have today is built on inheritance in a system that was established specifically to benefit white people. And I think it's important to know that and to understand that. Let me go on to a second theme here. That is the theme of European immigrants learning to become white and to take on white privileges. Sometimes I've wondered why it is that immigrants don't always empathize with the issues that other immigrants are experiencing, and that the descendants of immigrants seem to have forgotten some of the real hardships that immigrants experience. And I found out by looking into specifically some of the information I was able to find out about one ancestor, some of how all of that works, of the taking on of the white privilege identity and then gradually shedding the immigrant identity that a person brought. This story is a great-great-grandmother, Christine Burkhardt, who is an immigrant from Switzerland. Christine Burkhardt Conyas. I know more about her than about her husband, so I'll talk more about her and won't say too much about him. She came to the U.S., well, both of them came to the U.S. in the 1850s from Switzerland, and came to Vicksburg, Mississippi initially. So some things I know about her. In the 1850s, she would have brought from Switzerland several identities. An identity as a Swiss woman. I know that she was a milliner and a seamstress. She was a linguist. She spoke about 5 languages. And she was also an astrologer and a medium. She was, and that's something that's gotten passed down not to my side of the family, but to cousin's side of the family, of ability to sense things that many of the rest of us can't. I also know some about what she looked like, which I think is probably relevant to her almost aggressively taking on an identity as a white Southerner. She applied for a passport in 1871. I don't know if she went back to Switzerland or not, but very likely she did. But I know from the passport her description. They didn't take photos back then. They just wrote descriptions of the person. But if you look at the picture, or the description, she had dark complexion, black hair, and she was coming into a very racialized system in the United States. And you think to the categories in the census that I mentioned a while ago, of you can be classified as free white, in which you are conferred full privileges, except women didn't have full privileges on the basis of gender, but they still had racialized privileges, or slave, or other free. Well, looking at her, she could be other free, and she probably would not have wanted to have been other free, and particularly coming into the South. Now, in Vicksburg, she arrived just before the Civil War, she and her husband. Bad time to be moving into the South, but anyway, they probably didn't know. And he was a miller, And I think they probably came to Vicksburg because it was a milling center for milling cotton. And a big cotton mill was in the process of getting built, that they stopped building it during the Civil War, and it never really did get built. But both of them, the livelihoods that they brought from Switzerland really depended on cotton. She being a seamstress sewing clothes made of cotton, and him being a miller working in the processing of cotton. So they came from a place in which the work wasn't racialized, but into a context in which it was built on slavery. I know that she adopted a Southern white identity for a time on the basis of a story as well as the name of their fourth son. But the story is one that my cousin told me, and at first I didn't know if it was true or not, but I was able to go into Civil War history and verify not that particular story, but the general account of what happened. And the story that I heard is that she was home one day when General Grant was bringing his army in to try to retake Vicksburg for the North. And he was going door to door, knocking on doors, asking people to raise the Union flag. And so he got to the Conyas home, knock, knock, knock. Christine opens the door, and he says, Mrs. Conyas, if you raise the Union flag, we won't burn down your house. And she answered something, and he could see that she had an accent. And he said, well, okay, I can see that you're not American. So if you raise the French flag or the Swiss flag, we won't burn down your house. And she says, General, I'm American, I'm not Swiss anymore, and I live in the South. And so therefore I'm a white Southerner. And then she raised the Confederate flag, and he burned down the house. That's the story I heard. But the reality from a history that was written at the time by somebody who had witnessed it is that Grant did go from house to house, burning down the houses of people who didn't raise the Union flag. And then at the conclusion of the Civil War, or not quite, around the end of the Civil War, her fourth child was born, which she named after Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy. The next thing I was able to find out about her was in 1868, where she claimed an identity as a free white businesswoman with economic rights. And I found this in a Google book, a book that I Googled, and I did this by simply putting her name in just to see if anything would pop up, thinking nothing would. And lo and behold, this article came up in a book that was looking at bankruptcy law after the Civil War. And it turned out that she was an interesting case in point, because bankruptcy law was passed mostly so that white men, after the Civil War, would be able to get their economic finances back together by declaring bankruptcy so they could move on. And she, being a businesswoman, said, I'm going to use that law too. Not very many women tried to make use of it, but she did. And so therefore her case got written up in this book. Because her business was the making and selling of dresses, and a bunch of women hadn't been able to pay her for the dresses that she had made. She showed up again in the census in 1880, living in San Francisco. I'll get to the anti-Chinese activist part in a minute, because that wasn't in the census. But she apparently, after the Civil War, the economy of the South was terrible. And so a lot of Southerners, as the railroads were completed, used the railroads as transportation to go to San Francisco, where they heard things were a lot better, and you'll be able to make a living in San Francisco. So by 1880, her husband had died. She was living in San Francisco, working as a milliner and a dressmaker, and at the time had a Chinese servant. But I sent the link describing all of this to my family, and one of my sisters emailed back and said, hey, look what I found. This is an article in the Sacramento Bee, and it happened to, here's Christine Conyas, and it was about an organization that she had helped to found in 1882 for the protection of white working girls and against the employment of Chinese. And I assume that the Chinese servant that she had then was probably let go in the case of all of this. And I thought, what is this about? So I decided to look and see what was happening in the context of San Francisco then. Here's some demographic data, some census data about San Francisco in around then. And if you look at where I've circled, you'll see where all of a sudden the population of San Francisco really jumped. Both the white population jumped and the Chinese population jumped real fast. A lot of this was post-Civil War, of people going to San Francisco, hearing that this was the land of golden opportunity, and the Chinese who had finished working on the railroads, who then went back to California looking for additional work. So people were flooding into San Francisco faster than jobs were being created. And stories were being circulated at the time about working-class white girls who were losing their jobs to the Chinese. And one story that apparently was making the rounds was about some girl who was thrown out of her job and had to start working as a prostitute. And so these societies were set up, sort of protection of white working-class girls, with the assumption that the jobs belonged to white people, and to try to agitate against employment of people of Chinese descent. And the larger, and interestingly, it wasn't set up to protect Chinese girls. It was set up to protect white girls, very explicitly. But this was during a context in which there was a lot of agitation against the Chinese. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed by Congress in the same year. I'm not going to read all of this, but you can see all the various kinds of things, prohibitions that were being put against the Chinese in California, particularly in San Francisco, but California at large at the same time. So my great-great-grandmother was kind of participating in this larger scheme of trying to assert protections and privileges for white people in a racialized context. And even though she was in this context doing what might have made sense for her, there are alternatives and alternative ways of being and acting. And one of the things that I've always told my students is that we don't have to reproduce what we see going on around us. At the same time, when she was becoming an anti-Chinese activist, there were white people who were working against racism. This isn't exactly the same time, but it's another piece that I've sort of dug up, looked at German protests against slavery, of which there were actually quite a lot in the Midwest. I don't know that my family participated in any of them, but this was an example of one piece of action that was taken by some Germans in Kansas right before the Kansas citizens were supposed to vote whether or not Kansas was going to be a free state or a slave state. And the Germans had published this guide for new German arrivals to Kansas, and it told all kinds of things like what the weather is like and what to grow and what some of the local customs are and how to vote on the slavery issue. And it specifically said that the Germans here are against slavery, and so there's only 5 of them that are pro-slavery. And so if you're going to be a good, decent German citizen, you will oppose slavery as well. So there are alternatives in how we choose to act. Okay, the last theme I'll talk just sort of briefly about is the lost history of European-American bilingualism and biculturalism. And I'll be looking here at my grandmother's side of the family, on my father's side. This is my grandmother's family. The Reverend Henry Ross, my great-grandfather, immigrated from Germany in the 1860s, and then his wife, Mary Elizabeth Held Ross, was the daughter of German immigrants, and then my grandmother, Mamie Ross Sleater. But to back up a little bit, I'm going to go back to the Germans in south of Decatur, Illinois, and back to Wilhelm Schlichter, who had helped found a couple of important institutions. Shortly after he arrived, he helped found the Blue Mound Methodist Episcopal Church. Actually, it was the Zion Episcopal Church. Okay, I got that a little bit wrong. The Zion Episcopal Church in Blue Mound. There's been documentation that it was founded in his home. This is what the church looked like in a church bulletin in the early 1900s, and then this is what the church looks like today. He also helped establish a school for German children in the village, which was very common at the time, that the Germans didn't always send their kids to the public schools for several reasons. One was that they weren't so sure that the quality of education in the public schools was the world's greatest and thought the German public schools might be a little bit better, but also that the language was in German in the schools they established rather than in English. And because there were a lot of Germans coming into the Midwest, in 1839, Ohio established the first state authorization for bilingual education in German. Ohio was concerned about getting kids into the public schools because all of these German kids were going into German private schools, and Ohio wanted to boost its enrollment in the public schools. So it worked out agreements with the German communities of we will offer bilingual, German instruction, German English instruction if you'll send your kids to our schools. And so in 1839, German bilingual education was authorized in Ohio, shortly followed by Louisiana authorizing bilingual education in French and English, and the territory of New Mexico authorizing Spanish-English bilingual education. So there's a long history here to bilingual education in the U.S. And I know that my ancestors participated in bilingual institutions. This is the Reverend Henry Ross, my great-grandfather's photograph that was in his obituary. He, in 1875, completed seminary training to become a German Methodist Episcopal minister. And I looked into what the German Methodist Episcopal seminaries were like. There were two of them that were established in the U.S. that were turning out thousands of German Methodist Episcopal ministers, and they were specifically trained not only in German Methodist Episcopal theology, but also in both languages and being able to conduct services in both languages. And usually a service would be in a church conducted in, say, English in the morning and German in the afternoon, or vice versa. But they were proud that they were turning out bilingual ministers that were able to minister to a congregation that was bilingual and bicultural. He spent some time being an itinerant pastor in Iowa, and then for 6 years was a pastor in Muscatine, Iowa, and then moved down to Decatur, Illinois, where he was a pastor for a couple of years. And I think that that's probably where my grandparents met, was somewhere in the context of the German Methodist Episcopal Church. And then he worked for a number of years as secretary to the St. Louis Conference of the German Methodist Church, which was quite large by then. So he had then responsibilities throughout the Midwest for working with the German churches. And he was doing this work at a time when, back up a little bit. I know that the German churches were bilingual, not just because the ministers were trained bilingually, but also because of some of the newspaper articles. This was a newspaper article that featured some of the names of my relatives were in this article. And this was a meeting that was going on at the church. And you can see how it's written. Of some of the stuff was in German, some was in English. Everybody was bilingual, so everybody was happy with what was going on. And, reading these kinds of articles, I'm like, wow, yeah, the churches really were fostering a bilingual, bicultural community over a period of about 50 years. This was happening, though, at a time when German institutions were flourishing throughout the Midwest. In 1871, Prussia defeated France, and Germany was first established as a country. Before that, it had been separate countries, and so people identified as Prussian, Preußen, or as, I'm from Westfalen, but not as from Germany. But after Germany was established as a country, German people in the United States kind of resonated with the sense of national pride. By 1892, there were over 84 daily German newspapers in circulation, and I know that Milwaukee has continued to have German newspapers, at least until very recently. German architecture flourished, and of course we can see it throughout the Midwest. Right before World War I, there were 740 German Methodist Episcopal congregations throughout the Midwest. And one estimate is that during this time, over 1 million kids received their instruction in German, English, bilingual schooling. But it was always contested that the Germans had this language and culture thriving. Teddy Roosevelt was one of the outspoken critics. And you can read this quote that Teddy Roosevelt said about calling us dwellers in a polyglot boarding house. They were wanting to get rid of anything except English. World War I then was declared, and anything German was very forcibly persecuted, probably much stronger than most of us know, because the stories in most cases haven't gotten passed down, but they do appear in some German-American histories. These were some images that were prominently displayed about the Germans around World War I. And when you look at both of these images, they show Germany as being this big, ugly King Kong type of gorilla, and the United States as being this damsel in distress. The Germans also experienced violent repression of culture and language. By the end of the war, 26 states had outlawed the speaking of German. And this was like even on the phone. If the central operator, in party lines, heard you speaking German, you could get turned into the police and be fined, and you might even get tarred and feathered, because there were instances of that when people were caught speaking German. The German-American press was cut in half, mostly by companies refusing to advertise in the German-American press, but also by a lot of non-German stores refusing to sell or carry German newspapers, and so the German press was kind of squashed. Germans were interned during World War I and World War II in ways that were similar to the way the Japanese Americans were interned during World War II. In World War I in Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, somewhere around 6,000 Germans were rounded up and interned during the course of the war. Most schools stopped German instruction until it was declared illegal to do that, and then some of them resumed German instruction. In the libraries, many libraries had book burnings of books that had been written in German, so a lot of German knowledge just simply got destroyed. This didn't all completely get destroyed in my family. My grandmother stopped speaking German when I was growing up. I don't think I ever heard her speak German. She was a great German cook. But her two sisters continued to not only speak German, but later to teach German at Millikan University in Decatur, Illinois. And two of her sisters wrote this German textbook, and then one sister, Flora Ross, wrote a second German textbook. So while I had sort of thought I was the first person in the family writing textbooks, and I discover I also stand on a legacy of women before me who were writing textbooks. But the German language did persist, but it was at a great cost to people who had experienced the repression of German culture. And so they get this popular mythology today that Europeans just sort of came and immediately started speaking English. I pulled this off of MySpace about a year ago, and you can read it and see what it is. But this is somebody who doesn't know their own history, because the actual story is that many white immigrants, and the Germans may be the biggest example, but aren't the only example, that many European immigrants for a time did have bilingual, bicultural communities until the language and the culture was forcibly taken away from them. So when I look now at those of us who are white, who are saying things like, I don't have a culture. Well, we do have a culture of everyday life, but the historic culture we have that may have come from somewhere else, many of us don't know about it because it was forcibly taken away from us, and we don't have that history. We also don't have that history of how our ancestors chose to become white in order to avail themselves of the privileges that were legalized for people who were legally classified as white, and gave up a portion of who they were to be able to do that. So when we talk today about not having an identity, we do have an identity, but it's one that we have to go back and reconstruct. And it's an identity that I think it's really important for us to understand, both to be able to take responsibility for addressing institutional racism today, and like one of the things that we can do something about is change inheritance laws. If 80% of family wealth is basically passed down through inheritance, and the wealth tends to stay in white hands because of that. By changing inheritance laws, we could establish a playing field in which at least people get what they work for rather than have people getting what gets passed down to them. So there's a lot here that is I think, important for being able to kind of resurrect and understand. Cynthia Dillard has asked the question of how the weight of memory serves to delineate and define what it means to be who we are. And I think she asked the question of looking at this weight in memory, not so that we can feel bad about or good about or whatever we might feel about what happened in the past, but because of where we are today as authors of what will happen tomorrow. The history that gets written today and tomorrow hasn't happened yet. It'll depend on what we do. We're the authors of the present, and we have quite a bit of flexibility to behave and act in a variety of different ways. I think if we know the past better, then we can act maybe more deliberately to bring this country more in line with the ideals of justice and equity that the country espouses and still has yet to live up to. So I'd like to thank you for listening to my family stories, and I will look forward to maybe hearing some of your stories as you kind of plow around through your own background. Thank you.